My neighbor tried to get my backyard shed torn down. He called the city, filed a formal complaint, and probably pictured me standing there helpless while some inspector slapped a red notice on my door. What he didn't picture was the inspector looking over his fence. What he definitely didn't picture was the sound of his own concrete patio getting jackhammered a week later. I didn't move to Brook Hollow to start a cold war over property lines. It's a quiet little suburb outside Columbus, the kind of place where kids still ride bikes in the street and people argue about lawn fertilizer like it's a moral issue. When my wife, Hannah, and I bought our place, it was a modest 2-story colonial with a deep backyard and an old maple tree leaning slightly to the left like it had opinions. The shed came a year later. Nothing fancy, 12 by 10 feet. Same soft gray as the house, tucked against the rear fence, aligned clean with the lot lines. I built it mostly on weekends, sweating through Ohio humidity, measuring twice, sometimes 3 times because I'm that guy. Before I poured a single footing, I pulled permits, submitted drawings, waited for approvals, scheduled inspections. I even kept a folder in my desk labeled backyard structure like I was running a small construction firm out of my home office. The city inspector signed off without a single correction. I remember feeling proud, not because it was beautiful, but because it was done right. 3 years passed. Nobody cared. Nobody complained. Life hummed along in that comfortable suburban rhythm. Then Caleb Mercer moved in next door. He bought the place after old Mrs. Donnelly passed. I helped him carry a sofa inside the first week, introduced myself like any decent neighbor would. He had that polished energy about him, the kind of guy who irons his jeans and says things like market correction at backyard barbecues. Early 40s, worked in commercial real estate, drove a black SUV that always looked freshly waxed. Our first real conversation should have tipped me off. We were standing near the side yard while he was getting a survey done. He nodded toward the stakes in the ground and said, "So you know exactly where your boundary runs, right?" I laughed lightly. "Yeah, I've got the plat map." "Why?" "Just making sure. You'd be surprised how many people build without knowing." It was said casually, but there was a weight to it. 2 weeks later, he brought up the shed. "How close is that to the fence?" he asked, hands in pockets, voice neutral. "Complies with setback requirements," I said. 3 feet from the rear line, 5 from the side. I actually pulled permits. I even showed him the approval email on my phone. He looked at it, smiled thinly, and said, "That's good. Rules are there for a reason." Something in the way he said it didn't sit right. Over the next month, little comments trickled in. He mentioned how property values depend on uniformity. He talked about maintaining standards. He asked whether we were in the HOA review process for exterior additions, even though our section of Brook Hollow didn't technically require HOA approval for detached structures. It started to feel less like curiosity and more like an audit. Then one Tuesday afternoon, I came home from work and found a bright orange envelope taped to my front door. City of Brook Hollow Code Enforcement. Complaint received regarding unpermitted accessory structure constructed within restricted setback area. I stood there on the porch rereading it, feeling my pulse in my ears. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't panic. It was a slow, creeping irritation. I knew exactly who filed it. There were only 2 houses that shared that rear line, and Mrs. Donnelly wasn't filing complaints from the afterlife. Hannah stepped outside when she saw my face through the window. "What's wrong?" I handed her the notice. She scanned it, then looked up at me. "This is about the shed?" "Yep. You pulled permits." "I know." She exhaled slowly. "So what do we do?" I surprised myself by feeling calm. Not because I wasn't angry. I was. But it felt calculated on his end. Like he expected me to panic. To confront him. To maybe admit I'd cut a corner. I didn't confront him. Instead, I went upstairs and pulled out the folder. Original application. Approved site plan. Inspection sign-off sheet. Photos I'd taken during construction, showing the tape measure stretched from the boundary stakes to the foundation forms. I even had timestamps. I organized copies into a neat stack like I was preparing for a deposition. If he wanted to play this game, I was going to play it quietly. The inspection was scheduled for Friday morning. I took the day off work. Not because I was worried, but because I wanted to be present, prepared, steady. When the city truck pulled up, I walked out to greet the inspector before she even rang the bell. Her name was Denise Alvarez. Late 30s maybe, practical boots, clipboard tucked under her arm. The kind of person who has measured 1,000 properties and isn't impressed by drama. "Morning," she said. "Morning." I've got all the documentation ready. Her eyebrow lifted slightly, as if that wasn't what she usually encountered. We walked to the backyard. The grass was freshly cut. The shed stood there like it always had, harmless, quiet. Denise measured from the rear property line to the back wall, then from the side boundary to the corner post. She checked the site plan against her tablet. She measured again. Every number matched. Everything here checks out, she said finally. I felt that small surge of vindication rise in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't interested in gloating. I just wanted it over. I thought that would be the end of it. Then Denise paused. She looked past my shed, over the fence, into Caleb's yard. And her expression changed just slightly. That's when I realized this wasn't over yet. Denise didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, one hand shading her eyes from the sun, studying Caleb's backyard like she was solving a puzzle that had suddenly rearranged itself. From where we stood, you could see most of it. When he first moved in, the yard had a small square concrete slab just outside the sliding doors, maybe 8 by 8 feet, enough for a grill and 2 chairs. Now it stretched nearly the entire width of his house, stamped in a decorative stone pattern, clean edges, fresh color. And along the back, almost kissing the property line, stood a tall wooden privacy screen anchored in thick concrete footings. It hadn't been there 6 months ago. Denise glanced back at her tablet, then at the structure again. Was that patio always that size? She asked. No, I said honestly. He expanded it earlier this spring. She nodded slowly. And that screen along the rear. Do you know if that was permitted? I shrugged. I'm not sure. Which was true. I wasn't sure. But I had my suspicions. Denise walked toward the fence gate that separated our yards. Technically, it opened from my side. I unlatched it. Do you mind if I verify something next door? She asked. Not at all. She stepped through, and I followed a few paces behind, not because I needed to, but because I suddenly understood something Caleb clearly hadn't. When you call the city, you don't control what they look at. Caleb was outside already, like he'd been waiting for this moment. Sunglasses on, arms crossed, posture confident. Everything good? He asked, pretending not to know. Denise introduced herself. I'm here regarding a complaint about an accessory structure. While verifying measurements, I noticed recent improvements on your property and just need to confirm compliance. Caleb smiled, relaxed. Of course. We're all about compliance. There it was again. That word. Compliance. He loved it. Denise began measuring from his rear property line to the edge of the new patio. She crouched, pressed the tape measure flat, stood up, checked the number twice. Her expression tightened. She moved to the privacy screen, measured height. Then she tapped at her tablet for a long moment. Caleb shifted slightly. Is there an issue? I'm reviewing setback requirements for your lot classification, Denise said evenly. What happened next unfolded slowly, almost quietly, but it felt louder than any shouting match could have been. Mr. Mercer, she said, the extended patio encroaches approximately 18 inches into the required rear setback. Additionally, the privacy screen exceeds the maximum height for detached accessory structures by nearly 2 feet. Caleb let out a short laugh, like he thought she was joking. That can't be right. My contractor handled everything. Do you have permit documentation for the patio expansion and screen installation? He hesitated. It was subtle, but I saw it. Just a flicker. I don't have it on me, he said, but I'm sure it was filed. Denise scrolled again. I'm not seeing any permits issued for this address related to hardscape expansion or structural screening within the last 12 months. The air shifted. Caleb removed his sunglasses. Look, it's just concrete. And the screen is decorative. Everyone makes small improvements without running to City Hall every time they plant a post. Denise's tone stayed neutral. The rear portion of your lot includes a utility easement extending 5 feet inward from the property line. The footings for this structure appear to be set within that easement. That's ridiculous, he snapped, his calm veneer cracking. It's my backyard. It's your backyard, she agreed, but the easement grants access rights for utility maintenance. Permanent structures cannot be installed within it. I stood there quietly, hands in my pockets, feeling something complicated rise inside me. Not joy exactly. Not even satisfaction yet. It was more like the slow realization that the universe has a dry sense of humor. Caleb gestured toward my shed. What about his structure? That's the whole reason you're here. Denise glanced at me briefly. His shed complies with approved plans and setback regulations. We verified measurements. Caleb's jaw tightened. So what? You're just going to ignore this? It's barely over the line. I'm not ignoring anything, Denise replied calmly. Complaints trigger site verification. During verification, all visible structures may be reviewed for compliance. There it was. The sentence that changed everything. All visible structures. He'd opened the door, and now she was walking through it. Denise took a few photos, documented measurements, and began writing on her tablet. What does that mean exactly? Caleb asked, his voice losing that polished real estate smoothness. It means you'll receive a formal notice of violation. You'll be required to either obtain retroactive permits if eligible, or modify the patio and remove or reduce the privacy screen to comply with setback and height restrictions. Remove? He repeated. If corrective action is not taken within 30 days, daily fines may be assessed. Silence settled over the yard. Even the usual hum of distant lawn mowers felt muted. I caught his eye for a second. There was anger there, sure, but underneath it was something else. Embarrassment. Maybe even the dawning realization that he'd miscalculated. Denise wrapped up professionally, handed him a printed summary, and stepped back toward the gate. As she passed me, she said quietly, "You were smart to keep your paperwork." I nodded. Learned that the hard way on a kitchen remodel years ago. She gave a faint smile and left. The moment her truck pulled away, Caleb turned to me. "You could have said something." "About what?" I asked. "About the easement. About the setback." I blinked. "I didn't build it." "You knew." I held his gaze. "I knew my shed was legal. That's about it." He scoffed. "This is petty. Calling the city on a permitted structure?" I asked gently. His face flushed. For a second, I almost felt bad. Almost. But then I remembered the orange notice taped to my door. The implication that I was the kind of neighbor who cut corners. The subtle condescension every time he mentioned standards. This wasn't revenge. It was gravity. Over the next week, a certified letter arrived at his house. I saw him open it through his kitchen window, his shoulders sinking as he read. 2 days later, a white pickup truck pulled into his driveway. Then another. Contractors stepped out with saws and equipment. The first cut through that privacy screen echoed across both yards. The jackhammer came the next morning. Concrete cracked. Dust rose. The stamped pattern he'd probably paid extra for shattered into rough fragments. Each strike sounded like punctuation. I was on a conference call when the noise started, but I muted myself and stepped outside for a moment. Not to gloat, just to witness. Caleb stood near the sliding door, arms crossed again, but this time not in confidence. In defense, we didn't speak for weeks. When we did pass each other, it was stiff nods, tight smiles. Hannah asked me one evening if I felt guilty. A little, I admitted. But not for what happened. For how easily it could have been avoided. He could have just talked to me. He could have asked. Instead, he tried to flex authority, to weaponize the system. Maybe he thought I'd panic. Maybe he assumed I didn't have my paperwork in order. Maybe in his world, pressure worked. But in mine, documentation did. The contractors finished by the end of the month. The patio was cut back to code. The privacy screen was gone entirely, replaced with a shorter lattice panel that didn't require footings. From my yard, you could see more of his now. It struck me as ironic. He'd wanted control over what bordered his property. Now he had less privacy than before he started. We settled into a new kind of coexistence after that. Quieter, colder. But the story doesn't really end with the jackhammer. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about a shed or a patio. It was about something else entirely. For a while, the noise stopped but the tension didn't. You'd think once the concrete dust settled and the contractors drove off, that would be the end of it. Clean lines restored, setbacks respected, lesson learned. But neighborhoods don't reset that easily. You still take your trash cans to the curb on the same day. You still pull into adjacent driveways every evening. You still hear each other's dogs bark at 6:30 in the morning. And every time I stepped into my backyard, I was aware of the invisible line between us. At first, I told myself the story was simple. He tried to push me around. It backfired. End of moral equation. But the longer I sat with it, the more complicated it felt. Because Caleb wasn't some cartoon villain twirling a mustache over a zoning map. He was a guy who had just bought what was probably the most expensive house he'd ever owned. Real estate was his identity. Presentation mattered to him. Order mattered. Control definitely mattered. And my shed, even though it was permitted, neutral gray, structurally sound, represented something he hadn't approved. One evening in late September, about 6 weeks after the inspection, I was raking leaves near the back fence when he spoke up. "You got a minute?" I leaned on the rake handle. "Sure." He walked closer to the fence, not quite meeting my eyes at first. I shouldn't have filed that complaint. It wasn't dramatic. No swelling music. Just a statement hanging in cool autumn air. "Why did you?" I asked. He hesitated. "When I bought this place, the appraisal mentioned accessory structures nearby. My lender made some offhand comment about maintaining neighborhood standards. I guess I got in my head about it. I thought if something wasn't perfectly within code, it could affect value. And I assumed," he trailed off. "Assumed what?" "Assumed most people cut corners." There it was. The quiet confession. I nodded slowly. "I get wanting to protect your investment. But calling the city before knocking on my door, that felt like a move." He exhaled. There was no apology beyond that. Just an acknowledgement. "You know what the worst part was?" he said after a pause. "I didn't even check my own permits. I just trusted the contractor. Figured if I was the one pushing for standards, I must be fine." I almost laughed. That's the thing about rules. They don't care who quotes them. For the first time since he moved in, we both smiled at the same time. That conversation didn't turn us into friends. We weren't suddenly borrowing sugar or watching each other's houses during vacations. But it softened something. The sharp edge dulled. Still, the whole situation stuck with me longer than I expected. Because it forced me to look at myself too. When Denise was measuring his patio, when she mentioned the easement violation, there was a moment, just a split second, where I felt satisfied in a way that wasn't entirely noble. Not because justice was served, but because he was exposed. And that feeling bothered me. It's easy to frame these stories as karma, the universe balancing scales. But the truth is more mechanical than that. Systems respond to inputs. He filed a complaint. The system expanded its scope. That's not karma. That's process. What lingered wasn't triumph. It was awareness. I started thinking about how quickly neighborhood disputes escalate when pride gets involved. A fence 2 inches too tall becomes a statement. A shed becomes a threat. A patio becomes proof of hypocrisy. And underneath it all, it's rarely about lumber or concrete. It's about control. It's about fear of losing value, status, space. It's about assuming the worst before asking a question. A few months later, winter rolled in. Snow flattened everything into a clean white sheet, blurring property lines into abstraction. From my kitchen window, both yards looked identical. No patio edges. No shed measurements. Just quiet. One Saturday morning, I was out shoveling when Caleb walked over carrying 2 mugs. "Figured it's cold enough to call a truce coffee," he said, handing one over. We stood there in our driveways, steam rising from paper cups, breath visible in the air. "You ever think about how ridiculous that was?" he asked. "Which part?" "All of it. The complaint. The inspection. The jackhammer symphony." I chuckled. "I prefer the term percussion section." He laughed harder than I expected. Then he said something that stuck with me. I think I wanted to prove I had control over my surroundings. New house. New street. Didn't want to feel like the outsider. That landed differently. Because if I'm honest, I'd felt territorial too. Not about code, but about being here first. About knowing the rhythm of the place before he did. Maybe his questions felt like challenges to that. So maybe we were both defending invisible territory. The shed still stands. Same muted gray. Same 3-foot setback. I still keep the permit folder, though now it's more out of habit than fear. Caleb's patio is smaller now. Code compliant. The new lattice screen is modest, almost understated. Sometimes when I'm in the yard, I catch him measuring something else with a tape measure, a planter box, a small deck for his grill, and I see him double-checking distances. Once, he looked over and said, "Hey, what's the rear setback again? 3 feet or 5? 3 from the back, 5 from the side," I called out. He nodded like he was committing it to memory. And there's something oddly peaceful about that. No one filed another complaint. No one tried to flex authority again. But every time I think back to that bright orange notice taped to my door, I wonder how easily it could have spiraled further. Lawyers. HOA meetings. Years of passive-aggressive landscaping. Instead, it ended with concrete dust and an awkward apology over a fence. So here's the part one still wrestle with, and I'm curious what you think. Was I right to stay silent when the inspector looked into his yard? Should I have warned him beforehand, even after he tried to get my structure removed? Is silence the same as retaliation, or is it just letting consequences unfold? And on his side, Was he wrong to care about standards and property value? Or did he just go about it the worst possible way? Neighborhoods are strange ecosystems. We share fences, but not always trust. We live 10 feet apart, but sometimes worlds away in mindset. If you've ever dealt with a boundary dispute, a code complaint, an HOA showdown, I'd really like to hear your take. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Who crossed the line first? Where does responsibility actually begin? And if nothing else, maybe this story is just a reminder to knock on a door before you call an office. Because inspections don't stop at one fence line, and neither do consequences.